Restaurant owner throws out couple, but when he finds out who they really are. The evening that will change everything. Michael and Emma Winston had been eagerly anticipating their 10th wedding anniversary. They had meticulously planned the evening, choosing the Grand Oak, a renowned upscale restaurant. For the occasion, it was supposed to be a night of celebration, a time to reflect on the past decade of love and shared experiences. The excitement was palpable as they arrived, dressed elegantly, both confident that the night would unfold without issue. The restaurant itself was a picture of sophistication. Soft lighting illuminated the warm wooden interiors, and the staff, usually known for their exceptional service, greeted every guest with a smile. The Winstons felt like they were entering a place of prestige, a place where they would be treated with the care and respect that their anniversary deserved. However, as they stepped through the door, something felt wrong. It wasn't immediately obvious, but it was there. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. The hostess, who had greeted every other guest warmly, paused as she saw them. Her smile was stiff, strained, and she hesitated for a moment before motioning for them to follow. As they were led through the restaurant, they couldn't help but notice the way the staff glanced at them. It wasn't the usual friendly curiosity of a fine dining establishment. This felt different, almost uncomfortable. Once seated, the Winstons exchanged puzzled glances. The table was set perfectly, the ambiance romantic and elegant, yet a sense of unease lingered. They brushed it off at first, thinking it might just be nerves. After all, it was a special night, and perhaps their expectations were a bit too high. But it didn't take long for the discomfort to deepen. As they sat waiting for their server, Michael noticed a man observing them from a distance. The man, a waiter, looked at them in a way that felt far too focused, his gaze lingering just a second too long. Michael didn't recognize him, but something about his expression, a subtle mixture of recognition and detachment, set off a red flag in his mind. It was a look that didn't match the friendly, attentive demeanor he had come to expect from fine dining. When their server arrived, he introduced himself as Arnold. He was professional, though there was something cold about his greeting. Arnold's demeanor was polite but distant, and his eyes flickered between Michael and Emma in an unsettling way. It felt as though he knew something they didn't, as though he were assessing them in a way that went beyond a simple customer service interaction. The evening's tension grew with each passing moment. The food arrived and was, of course, excellent, but no amount of expertly prepared dishes could mask the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every time they made eye contact with Arnold, it was as if the air thickened, charged with an unspoken tension. When the bill was finally presented, the unease came to a head. Arnold's smile, once professional, now seemed forced. As he handed over the check, his gaze flickered toward the door and his posture stiffened. The atmosphere felt colder than it had all evening. Michael and Emma exchanged confused looks, both of them growing increasingly uncomfortable, but they decided to pay and leave without making a scene. However, when the transaction was complete and they tried to stand up, they were met with an unexpected barrier. Arnold's demeanor shifted. He was no longer the courteous waiter, but someone with an air of authority, an authority that felt out of place in a simple dining exchange. It was then that the full weight of the situation hit Michael. The waiter's behavior wasn't random. There was a deliberate coldness to it. This wasn't just about poor service. This was something deeper, something far more insidious. The realization came like a sudden slap. They were being treated differently, not because of anything they had done, but because of who they were. Michael felt the sting of recognition. It was clear now that their skin color was the reason for this treatment. It was racism, plain and simple. The glances, the hesitation, the coldness, all of it had been part of a system of discrimination, masked by the illusion of fine dining. As they left the restaurant, Emma clutched Michael's arm, her eyes wide with shock and anger. They were walking out of the place they had carefully chosen for their celebration, but the weight of the night's events was heavier than any romantic memory. They had been made to feel unwelcome, unwanted, not because of anything they had done, but because of who they were. This was no longer just about an unpleasant evening. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Michael knew deep down that they weren't just walking away from an evening spoiled by poor service. They were walking away from a fight that was about to change everything. The encounter with the restaurant that should have been their celebration. The moments after Michael and Emma Winston left the Grand Oak were filled with confusion, anger, and disbelief. What was supposed to be a special celebration had turned into a deeply uncomfortable ordeal, tainting what should have been a night of joy with something far darker. As they drove away from the restaurant, the silence between them was thick, broken only by the sound of the car's engine and the occasional sigh from Emma. Michael's mind raced as he replayed every moment of the evening, the strange behavior from the hostess, the coldness from Arnold, the awkwardness in the air that neither of them could fully place. It had all been so subtle, so sneaky that it took time for the truth to fully sink in. But when it did, it was undeniable. They had been discriminated against. And worse, it had been done under the guise of exclusivity and refinement, making it even more sinister. Emma, too, was in shock. She had always prided herself on being someone who could easily navigate any situation, no matter how difficult. But this was different. She was forced to confront something that, deep down, she knew was always lurking. An insidious prejudice that existed in spaces they thought were beyond such bias. But neither Michael nor Emma were the type to let things slide, especially not when it came to something as serious as this. Their wedding anniversary had been ruined, but their resolve to stand up against this injustice only grew stronger with every passing minute. As they pulled into their driveway, Michael felt a sense of urgency building within him. He wasn't going to let this go. He knew that this wasn't just a random act of poor judgment. It was part of a bigger, more troubling picture. There were too many questions that needed to be answered. Why had they been singled out? Who else had experienced this kind of treatment? And most importantly, who was behind this decision? In that moment, Michael made a vow. He was going to find out the truth, and when he did, he wasn't going to let anyone ignore it. The next day, Michael went to work, but his mind kept wandering back to the events at the restaurant. His thoughts were clouded, and despite his best efforts to focus on his business dealings, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had to be done. He couldn't ignore it, not when the system had so clearly been rigged against him and Emma. After a few calls and some discreet inquiries, Michael began to uncover details that he hadn't expected. Arnold, the waiter who had treated them with such cold disdain, wasn't just some low-level employee at the restaurant. No, Arnold was the manager, and not just any manager, but one who had been with the Grand Oak for years. His connections within the company were deep, and it seemed that his behavior was not an isolated incident. There had been whispers of complaints from other customers, but they had been brushed aside, dismissed as misunderstandings or isolated incidents. But Michael wasn't about to let this go. He knew he had to find out more. And then a breakthrough. He discovered that Arnold, along with some of the other upper management at the restaurant, had ties to the owner, a man by the name of Gerald. Gerald, the very man who had orchestrated their humiliation the night before. The pieces were starting to come together, and Michael could feel his blood begin to boil. It wasn't just a waiter's poor attitude that had led to their mistreatment. It was the systemic racism embedded within the restaurant itself, starting at the top. Gerald, the owner, had created a culture that allowed discrimination to thrive, and now Michael had the key to exposing it all. He didn't have to think twice. He knew exactly what needed to be done. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. He wasn't just going to sit back and let this continue. The very next day, Michael began planning his next move, ready to take on the system that had tried to tear him down. He was determined to show Gerald, Arnold, and anyone else who had been complicit in this that their actions would have consequences. He wasn't going to be just another victim of a corrupt system. He was going to take it down, one brick at a time. The first signs of discontent. As the days passed after the incident at the Grand Oak, Michael's mind began to settle into a singular focus. The anger he initially felt started to evolve into a burning determination. The more he learned about the restaurant's internal structure, the more he understood how deep the problem ran, and the more he realized just how dangerous this culture of discrimination had become. But as he dug deeper into the issue, the questions kept piling up. How long had this been happening? Were there others who had been treated like he and Emma? What kind of hold did Gerald, the restaurant's owner, have over the community? What kind of person would allow such behavior to persist, especially at a restaurant that prided itself on being one of the finest establishments in town? Despite all his digging, Michael could never have anticipated the shocking revelations he was about to uncover. As he pieced together the puzzle, he started to realize that this wasn't just a single instance of racism. No, it was much more systemic than that. What Michael was facing wasn't just about a single bad actor. It was about an entire culture that had been cultivated over years, a culture where money and power were prioritized over humanity and equality. It started innocently enough. Michael asked a few questions of former and current employees, and at first their responses were vague, almost as if they were afraid to speak out. But as he kept pushing, more and more pieces started to fall into place. A former manager who had been with the company for several years confided in Michael about the internal dynamics that had made the restaurant's culture so toxic. She explained how employees who were Black or of other minority backgrounds were systematically marginalized in ways that were barely visible to customers, but painfully evident to those who worked behind the scenes. The more Michael listened, the clearer the picture became. Employees were routinely excluded from important decision-making processes. Even when they were offered positions of authority, they were undermined by their white counterparts or dismissed outright. Promotions were rare for Black employees, and they were often given the least favorable shifts, no matter how hard they worked or how much experience they had. The manager explained that she had tried for years to bring up these issues to Gerald, but every time she was dismissed. It was always the same excuses. "It's not the right time," or "You're being too sensitive." Gerald, as the owner, turned a blind eye to these issues, ignoring the damage being done within his own walls. Michael listened intently, piecing together the hidden truths behind the polished exterior of the Grand Oak. It became clear that this wasn't just about one incident. The problem was far larger than he had originally thought. It was the very foundation of how the restaurant operated. And the man at the center of it all was Gerald. Gerald was an individual who had built his restaurant empire on exclusivity. The Grand Oak was known for its high prices, its elite clientele, and its reputation for serving only the best. To Gerald, appearances were everything. The restaurant was a reflection of his own sense of status, of the life he had worked so hard to build. And, like so many others in positions of power, Gerald had carefully crafted an environment that allowed racism and elitism to flourish unchecked. His policies weren't written in black and white, but they were there nonetheless, embedded in the culture of the company. It was a silent agreement among those in power, the kind of agreement that allowed discrimination to continue without ever being challenged. Michael, despite his growing anger, knew that he had to act quickly. The evidence was piling up, and with each passing day, he could feel the weight of the truth becoming unbearable. He needed to take his next step, but this was no longer just about him or his personal vendetta. This was about something much bigger. This was about ensuring that Gerald, Arnold, and everyone else who had allowed this environment to fester would be held accountable. He knew that to take them down, he would need more than just words. He would need proof, irrefutable proof that would force the authorities to take action. So Michael did what any successful businessman would do when faced with a challenge. He started to gather evidence. He tapped into his network of contacts, speaking to people who had witnessed the daily discrimination and harassment that went on behind the closed doors of the restaurant. Slowly but surely, Michael began to compile a mountain of evidence. There were emails, reports, and testimonies from current and former employees that painted a damning picture of life at the Grand Oak. These documents told the story of a deeply entrenched system of bias, where black employees were systematically denied opportunities and subjected to humiliating treatment. And this wasn't just happening with one or two employees. This was a widespread issue that had affected dozens, if not hundreds, of workers over the years. But Michael knew that gathering the evidence was only half the battle. The next step was going public, and this would be the hardest part. The restaurant was well connected, its reputation solidified through years of wealth and influence. Gerald had the ear of powerful people in the community, and he had the means to bury any scandal that might arise. Michael realized that this would be an uphill battle, but he was no longer afraid. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. With his evidence in hand, Michael reached out to Emma. He shared everything he had uncovered, the stories, the documentation, the undeniable proof that Gerald's empire was built on a foundation of racism. Emma, who had stood by his side through thick and thin, was ready for the next step. Together they formulated a plan to expose the restaurant's systemic racism to the world. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they also knew that the impact of their actions would reach far beyond their own lives. Michael wasn't just fighting for himself and Emma anymore. He was fighting for every person who had been mistreated, every person who had been cast aside because of the color of their skin. It was time for the truth to be heard, and Michael was determined to make sure that the consequences for Gerald and his cronies would be severe. This wasn't just a fight for justice for one couple. This was a fight to change the industry, to change the world. Hidden hatred behind the smile. As Michael and Emma Winston continued their preparations to expose the truth, the pressure grew heavier with every passing day. They knew that what they were about to undertake was far beyond anything they had ever dealt with before. What started as a personal affront, an unjust act of discrimination at a restaurant that should have been a place of celebration, had now escalated into a battle for justice that threatened to unravel an entire system built on lies. The Winstons had managed to gather a solid case against the Grand Oak. They had testimonies, documents, and recordings that spoke volumes about the restaurant's discriminatory practices. But Michael knew that evidence alone would not be enough. They needed more. They needed to uncover Gerald's role in all of this. Not just his awareness of the discrimination, but his active participation in perpetuating it. Gerald, as the owner of the restaurant, was a man who prided himself on his social standing and wealth. He was a man who had worked hard to create an exclusive brand that catered to the rich and powerful. But as Michael dug deeper, he realized that Gerald was far more than just an arrogant businessman. He was a man who was willing to sacrifice his values for the sake of maintaining his status. His beliefs were deeply entrenched in the idea that some people were simply better than others, and that his wealth and influence allowed him to get away with it. The more Michael learned about Gerald's background, the more the pieces began to fit together. Gerald had grown up in a wealthy, privileged family, surrounded by an environment where race and class were used as ways to distinguish between the worthy and the unworthy. This upbringing had shaped Gerald's worldview in ways that were both subtle and pervasive. It wasn't just that he disliked black people. It was that he viewed them as inferior. He believed that the only people who deserved to have power, status, and respect were those who came from the right background, people who looked like him. This hidden hatred, masked behind a polished smile and a well-tailored suit, was the foundation of everything Gerald had built. His restaurant, the Grand Oak, wasn't just about serving fine food and providing luxury experiences. It was about reinforcing his ideology of elitism, of keeping certain people in their place. And to him, that place was far below the privileged diners who frequented his establishment. The more Michael uncovered, the angrier he became. He had thought that Gerald was simply another example of the kind of ignorance and prejudice that existed in society, but now he saw the true depth of the problem. Gerald wasn't ignorant. He wasn't just a fool who didn't know better. He was a man who had deliberately constructed a system that kept people like Michael and Emma, and so many others, on the outside, struggling to be seen as equals. But Michael wasn't ready to back down. He had known for a long time that in order to fight the system, you had to understand how it worked. He had built his own empire from the ground up, and he wasn't about to let someone like Gerald use his power to destroy the lives of hard-working people simply because of their race. Now, armed with the truth, Michael was ready to go public, but before he could take the next step, he had one more thing to uncover: the people who had enabled Gerald's actions. It wasn't just Gerald who was responsible for the culture of racism at the Grand Oak. There were others, employees, managers, and even patrons, who had allowed it to flourish either through ignorance or complicity. Michael's next move was to identify these people and to make sure that they, too, would be held accountable for their actions. He reached out to former employees who had worked under Gerald and Arnold, seeking out those who had witnessed the toxic culture firsthand but had been too afraid to speak out. Many of them were reluctant at first, fearing the repercussions of crossing Gerald. But as the pressure mounted, and as the story began to gain more traction, more and more individuals came forward. What Michael learned next would shake him to his core. These people weren't just bystanders to the racism that was happening at the Grand Oak. They were active participants, perpetuating the system in subtle but dangerous ways. Some of them were managers who had been complicit in turning a blind eye to complaints from black employees. Others were patrons who had openly voiced their disapproval of the diversity of the restaurant staff, subtly reinforcing the notion that certain individuals didn't belong in spaces of luxury and power. Michael compiled everything: the testimonies, the records, the documented instances of discrimination. He now had a clear picture of just how widespread this toxic culture was. It wasn't just Gerald or Arnold who were responsible. The problem was much larger. It was the entire ecosystem of the Grand Oak, from the top to the bottom. With everything in place, Michael and Emma knew it was time to act, but they couldn't just rely on the evidence alone. They needed a way to make sure the world saw what they had uncovered. They needed to ensure that Gerald, Arnold, and the entire network of enablers would be held accountable for their actions. The stakes had grown higher than ever before, and Michael wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been discriminated against, every person who had been treated as less than because of their race or background. And so the plan was set in motion. Michael and Emma would take the next step. They would go public, and they would do it in a way that would leave no room for denial. Their goal was clear. They would tear down the walls of elitism and expose the deeply entrenched racism that had been allowed to thrive unchecked for far too long. The secret revealed. The night before Michael and Emma were set to reveal the truth to the world, they both lay awake, reflecting on the magnitude of what they were about to do. The weight of their actions felt both empowering and overwhelming at the same time. What had started as a personal quest for justice had quickly evolved into a movement, one that would shake the foundations of an entire industry, challenge an entrenched culture, and expose the systemic racism that had been thriving under the guise of exclusivity and sophistication. Michael stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with the final details of the plan. He had already contacted several media outlets, including investigative journalists known for their work in exposing corporate corruption and discrimination. He knew that once the truth came out, the eyes of the world would be on the Grand Oak and on Gerald. He couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction at the thought of Gerald squirming under the pressure, knowing that the man who had spent so many years hiding behind his wealth and status would finally have to answer for his actions. Emma, lying next to him, felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. She had always been a supportive partner, but she knew that the road ahead would be difficult. They were about to go up against one of the most powerful people in the city, a man whose restaurant had been a symbol of luxury and prestige for decades. Gerald had built an empire, and now they were going to tear it down. But the Winstons were resolute. They had the truth on their side, and they were no longer willing to stay silent in the face of injustice. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, Michael and Emma's plan was set into motion. They contacted a trusted journalist named Sarah, who had been following their story from the beginning. Sarah was known for her tenacity and had a reputation for exposing corruption in the most powerful institutions. Michael knew that with Sarah's help, the story would reach the right audience, and the scandal would spread like wildfire. They met Sarah at a discreet location, a small cafe tucked away in the corner of the city. The air was thick with anticipation as they exchanged the evidence they had gathered. The dossier was thick, filled with testimonies, emails, internal documents, and audio recordings that exposed the inner workings of the Grand Oak, from Gerold's discriminatory policies to Arnold's role in enforcing them. Sarah took the documents, promising to investigate them thoroughly and run the story as soon as possible. The clock was ticking, and Michael and Emma couldn't help but feel a surge of adrenaline. They had waited so long for this moment, and now there was no turning back. The public would soon know what had been happening behind closed doors, and the fallout would be immense. As Sarah left to begin her investigation, Michael and Emma sat together, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The sense of justice was strong, but so was the realization that they were about to change the lives of many, not just their own. They had given a voice to those who had suffered in silence for far too long, and they were about to make sure that those responsible for their suffering would finally face the consequences of their actions. Hours later, Sarah contacted them with the news they had been waiting for. She had secured a meeting with a major news outlet, and the story was set to run within the next 24 hours. The details of Gerold's empire, the culture of discrimination at the Grand Oak, and the role of its employees in perpetuating these injustices would soon be laid bare for the world to see. As the story went live, Michael felt a rush of emotions: relief, anger, and a deep sense of satisfaction, all mixed together. But it was only the beginning. As the media began to pick up the story, it quickly became clear just how widespread the impact would be. The story went viral, with people across the country, and even internationally, weighing in. The outrage was immediate, with many expressing shock and disgust at the lengths to which Gerold had gone to protect his reputation and profits at the expense of those who had been marginalized. The fallout was swift. The restaurant's online reviews flooded with angry comments and accusations. Social media exploded with hashtags calling for a boycott of the Grand Oak, and people began sharing their own stories of discrimination, both at the restaurant and in other places. For many, the Winston story had sparked something much bigger, a conversation about race, privilege, and the systems that allowed such abuses to continue unchecked. Gerold, who had once walked through life with an air of invincibility, suddenly found himself at the center of a scandal that threatened to destroy everything he had built. His phone began to ring off the hook, with reporters demanding answers, investors pulling out, and high-profile clients distancing themselves from the restaurant. The media painted him as a villain, a man who had used his wealth and influence to maintain a racist, exclusionary culture. And it wasn't just Gerold who was in trouble. Arnold, the manager, became a target as well. His involvement in the systemic mistreatment of black employees was laid bare for all to see, and it was clear that his career would be forever tainted by the public's perception of him as a racist enabler. In the following days, the news spread even further, and Gerold found himself facing lawsuits, from former employees, including those who had come forward with their own testimonies of mistreatment. Even more shocking, the local government launched an investigation into the company's practices, and federal agencies began to take an interest in the case as well. But the most devastating blow came when Garold was forced to address the public. He appeared in a televised interview, attempting to salvage his reputation, but it was clear to everyone watching that the damage had already been done. The man who had once been the face of sophistication and success was now seen as the embodiment of everything that was wrong with the system, a symbol of unchecked power and privilege. As the interview ended, Garold was left in the ruins of his own making, facing the consequences of his actions. But Michael and Emma Winston weren't done yet. They had started a movement, one that would continue to grow and demand accountability from those who thought they could get away with injustice. And in the end, it wasn't just about bringing Garold down. It was about sending a message to every other business, every other person in power, that racism and discrimination would no longer be tolerated. Michael and Emma had fought for what was right, and they were about to make sure that their victory wasn't just a personal one, but one that would resonate throughout society. Consequences of a foolish mistake. As the world watched Garold's empire crumble, Michael and Emma Winston felt a sense of bittersweet triumph. The battle was not yet won, but they had dealt the first devastating blow to the man who had humiliated them and countless others. Yet, as the media frenzy continued and Garold's downfall became a headline in nearly every major publication, the true consequences of his actions began to unfold. It was one thing for the public to condemn him, but it was entirely another when the financial ramifications began to hit home. The backlash from the media, combined with the growing support for Michael and Emma, had ripple effects that no one could have predicted. Garold's first response to the public outcry was to try and maintain a sense of control. He hired a public relations firm, one of the best in the business, to help him salvage whatever was left of his reputation. But this was no ordinary scandal. It wasn't just a case of poor customer service or a bad review. It was a revelation of a deeply ingrained, institutionalized problem within his business, and no amount of polished speeches or crisis management could undo the damage. The PR firm worked tirelessly, crafting statements that attempted to distance Garold from the core issues at hand, claiming that he had not been aware of the extent of the discrimination taking place under his roof. But those words rang hollow to a public that had already seen too much. For years, Garold had fostered a culture of exclusivity and elitism, where those who didn't fit his narrow ideal of worthiness were sidelined or, worse, systematically mistreated. The financial impact was immediate. The restaurant's stock price, once a symbol of prestige and growth, began to plummet. Longtime patrons, once proud to be seen dining at the Grand Oak, started to distance themselves, either quietly or publicly, from the establishment. Those who had once enjoyed the restaurant's luxurious offerings now found themselves grappling with the reality of supporting a business that stood for everything they despised. The ripple effects didn't stop with the customers. Garold's investors, many of whom had ties to prominent figures in the business world, began to withdraw their support. The investors weren't just losing money, they were losing face. Being associated with a scandal like this, one that involved racial discrimination, was too much for them to risk. Slowly but surely, the once glamorous image of the Grand Oak began to fade. What had been a crown jewel in the city's dining scene was now a tarnished relic of a bygone era. Behind closed doors, Gerald's employees were starting to feel the shift. Arnold, the manager who had been complicit in perpetuating the culture of discrimination, was no longer able to rely on his position for protection. The pressure was mounting, and the once supportive network he had enjoyed within the restaurant now began to turn against him. Those who had once remained silent, either out of fear or apathy, were now speaking up. The employees who had been systematically marginalized were finding their voices, and the voices of others who had remained silent for too long were being amplified. As for Gerald, the financial strain was beginning to mount in ways he hadn't anticipated. The backlash had turned into a series of legal battles. Lawsuits from former employees who had been discriminated against were flooding in. Each case, each claim of unfair treatment, discrimination, or harassment added fuel to the fire. Gerald had tried to bury it all before, but now it was all coming to light, and there was nowhere left to hide. His legal team was working overtime to manage the dozens of lawsuits piling up. At first, Gerald thought he could throw money at the problem, that he could settle out of court, pay the victims off, and move on with his life. But it wasn't that simple anymore. The case against him had become a symbol of everything wrong with the business world, and no amount of money could make it go away. Lawyers began to tell him that a settlement wouldn't be enough. The public needed to see that he was held accountable. The damage to his reputation couldn't be fixed by simply paying off those who had been wronged. No, now the law was coming for him. In the midst of the legal battles, Gerald found himself retreating into isolation. He had always prided himself on his self-sufficiency, his ability to control every aspect of his business. But now he was facing something that he couldn't control. The more he tried to fight it, the worse it became. His friends, once loyal and eager to be seen in his circle, now kept their distance. The once powerful man was now a shell of himself, watching as everything he had built began to collapse. And yet, amid all the chaos, one thing became clear: the Winstons weren't done. Their fight wasn't just about exposing Gerald, it was about changing the culture that allowed men like him to thrive unchecked. Their success in bringing this issue to light was only the beginning. Michael had always believed that justice would prevail, but he also knew that the work was far from over. For every step Gerald took to try and stop the downfall, Michael and Emma took 2 steps forward. They were working tirelessly, speaking with lawmakers, business leaders, and activists to ensure that this would not just be a single victory, but a catalyst for real change. They knew that the restaurant industry, and many other industries, needed to be held accountable for the discrimination that had long been allowed to persist under the surface. As Gerald sat in his office, his empire crumbling around him, he couldn't help but realize the gravity of the mistake he had made. If only he had thought before acting. If only he had recognized that the system he had built on exclusivity and discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was financially unsustainable. He had never anticipated that someone would be brave enough to take him on. And now it was too late. The consequences of his foolish mistake were unraveling everything he had ever worked for. Michael and Emma Winston were no longer just victims of a racist system. They were now agents of change, leading the charge for a more equitable future in the hospitality industry. The fall of Gerald was just the beginning, and Michael knew that the battle they had fought would have far-reaching implications that would resonate for years to come. The beginning of the investigation and media outcry. The world had already begun to take notice. What started as a quiet dinner gone wrong for Michael and Emma Winston had evolved into a scandal of monumental proportions. The story spread far and wide, with media outlets, journalists, and influencers all picking up the narrative and amplifying its significance. But what Michael and Emma didn't anticipate was how quickly their fight for justice would begin to resonate across the nation. This wasn't just about one restaurant or one owner. This was about an industry-wide issue that had long been swept under the rug. The media's coverage of the story exploded. Sarah, the investigative journalist who had worked with Michael and Emma, was at the center of the storm. She had managed to secure an exclusive, and as the story ran, her phone started to buzz nonstop. Reporters from every major outlet wanted to speak with her, eager to get the full scoop. In the meantime, Michael and Emma remained largely in the background, their names attached to the story but still somewhat hidden from the public eye. The attention was overwhelming, but the Winstons knew it was essential. They couldn't afford to back down now. The first wave of media coverage hit with an almost overwhelming intensity. News outlets ran stories on the systemic racism that had plagued the Grand Oak for years, bringing forth the testimony of former employees, current staff, and even a few high-profile patrons who had witnessed the discrimination firsthand. As each piece of the puzzle fell into place, it was clear that Gerald and his establishment had long been able to operate unchecked, largely due to their wealth and influence in the community. But the real shocker came when reporters uncovered an entire web of institutionalized racism, not just at the Grand Oak, but at several other restaurants owned by Gerald. The more the journalists dug, the more they unearthed. There were whispers of other instances where black employees had been turned away, or where customers of color had been treated with suspicion and disrespect. What had appeared to be an isolated case was, in fact, part of a much larger and more disturbing pattern of discrimination that stretched across Gerald's entire empire. The public's reaction was swift and fierce. People were outraged. What had started as a quiet story about one couple's mistreatment had now become a symbol of something much larger: the pervasive, deeply rooted racism that existed in the most unlikely of places. The #sign Boycott the Grand Oak began to trend on social media, with thousands of people voicing their support for Michael and Emma while condemning Gerald's actions. At first, Gerald tried to maintain control. He had long been used to being in power, and the idea that someone could challenge him, especially in his own industry, was foreign to him. His lawyers worked overtime, trying to suppress the details that were leaking to the press. They threatened lawsuits, they issued public statements, and they tried to bury the truth under a mountain of legalese. But nothing they did could silence the growing outcry from the public. As the story continued to gain traction, Gerald's business partners began to pull away. Investors who had once been eager to associate with the prestigious restaurant now recoiled at the negative publicity. The corporate board, many of whom had been longtime friends of Gerald, began to distance themselves from him. They saw the writing on the wall. Even though Gerald still had money and influence, it was clear that his empire was in jeopardy. The once untouchable business mogul was now on the defensive, and his support system was quickly crumbling. Meanwhile, Michael and Emma knew that the real work had only just begun. The media frenzy was only the first step in exposing the full extent of what had been happening behind closed doors. The Winstons had successfully drawn the world's attention to the issue, but now it was time to ensure that real, lasting change would come from it. They were determined not to let Gerald's downfall be just another corporate scandal. This was their moment to make sure that the systemic racism they had uncovered would not be forgotten. As the public outcry reached a fever pitch, Michael and Emma began meeting with lawmakers, human rights organizations, and other business leaders who were equally concerned about the implications of the scandal. They wanted to ensure that the story wasn't just a fleeting news cycle, that it would lead to real, tangible reforms in the way businesses operated. The calls for accountability grew louder. People wanted more than just apologies. They wanted change. They wanted policies that would protect employees from discrimination and ensure that companies could no longer hide behind their wealth and status to perpetuate harmful practices. Meanwhile, the investigation into the Grand Oak and Gerald's other businesses was gaining momentum. Federal authorities had started to take a closer look at the chain of restaurants, and several whistleblowers came forward to provide even more damning evidence. Michael's decision to go public with everything he had uncovered had sparked a firestorm that would not be easily extinguished. But Gerald wasn't done fighting just yet. As the pressure mounted, he tried to shift the narrative. He publicly declared that he was committed to making things right, promising to institute new diversity programs within his restaurants, and claiming that he would work with organizations to rectify the discrimination that had taken place under his watch. But even as he made these promises, it was clear that they were too little, too late. The public had already made up its mind. They weren't just looking for empty promises, they wanted action. The investigation continued to unearth new revelations, and the legal battles began to multiply. Gerald faced multiple lawsuits from former employees, as well as customers who had been discriminated against. His once pristine reputation was in tatters, and the financial damage was starting to pile up. His attempts to salvage what was left of his business were failing. As the news cycle dragged on, more and more businesses began to reconsider their ties with Gerald's restaurants. Local celebrity chefs who had once praised the fine dining experience at the Grand Oak now distanced themselves publicly from Gerald, joining in the growing chorus of condemnation. The restaurant's regulars, once the core of its success, were now choosing to support more inclusive dining establishments, sending a clear message to Gerald that his time at the top was over. For Michael and Emma, the fight was far from over. They had ignited a movement, but they knew that the battle for justice was just beginning. The real victory would be in the lasting changes that would come from exposing Gerald's empire. They had started something that could fundamentally change the way the restaurant industry and the corporate world as a whole operated. But for now, they could take a moment to breathe. The story they had fought so hard to bring to light had reached the world. They had taken the first step toward justice, and the world was watching. The hidden hatred behind the smile. As the media's spotlight continued to shine on the Grand Oak, the fallout from Gerald's actions spread like wildfire. The restaurant's reputation, once associated with sophistication and luxury, was now synonymous with racism, discrimination, and elitism. But Michael and Emma Winston were not the only ones who had suffered under Gerald's reign. With every passing day, more victims began to come forward. revealing the true extent of the restaurant's discriminatory culture. It wasn't just the employees of color who had been mistreated. It was the customers, too. Many patrons, those who had once frequented the restaurant and supported its exclusivity, began to realize that they had been complicit in perpetuating the very system that had kept people like Michael and Emma at the margins. The truth was becoming undeniable, and Garold's carefully curated world was slowly unraveling. Behind the scenes, Michael continued to dig deeper into the inner workings of Garold's empire. He had already uncovered a wealth of evidence, testimonies from former employees, email correspondences, and internal documents detailing the discriminatory practices that had been normalized under Garold's leadership. But now he needed to understand the man himself. He needed to know just how deep the hatred ran, how much of it had been woven into the fabric of the restaurant, and whether Garold's personal beliefs were at the core of the business's toxic culture. The more Michael uncovered, the clearer it became that Garold's racism wasn't just a matter of bad judgment or poor management. It was a calculated ideology that he had built into every aspect of his restaurant. From the employees he hired to the patrons he catered to, Garold's belief system had been at the heart of his operation. He saw the Grand Oak as a reflection of his own status, a place where only those deemed worthy, those who fit his narrow definition of success and sophistication, were allowed to thrive. Anyone who didn't fit that mold was relegated to the margins, ignored, or outright excluded. And this belief was reflected in every decision Garold made. The hiring practices at the Grand Oak were discriminatory by design, with a clear preference for white employees in leadership positions, despite the qualifications of other candidates. Even when qualified black or minority employees were hired, they were often assigned menial roles, excluded from important meetings, or given the least favorable shifts. Those who dared to speak up were either silenced or quietly pushed out of the company. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came when Michael discovered the extent of Garold's personal involvement in maintaining this toxic culture. It wasn't just the restaurant's policies that were racist. Garold himself had crafted a narrative that justified discrimination as a form of elitism. He had convinced himself that his wealth, status, and power made him superior to those who didn't share his background. He believed that his exclusive restaurant was a reflection of his own superiority, a place where only the right kind of people were welcome. This deep-seated belief was not something Garold had hidden. In fact, it was something he actively displayed, both in his personal interactions and in the way he ran his business. He would frequently make comments to staff about how the restaurant needed to keep up appearances, referring to the importance of maintaining an elite clientele. These comments weren't just about the food or the service. They were about who was allowed to enjoy the experience. Garold's exclusionary practices were grounded in a deeply ingrained sense of superiority, one that Michael now saw was at the root of all the injustice at the Grand Oak. For Michael, this revelation was the final piece of the puzzle. It was clear now that Garold's actions had been intentional, driven by a belief system that placed him and his kind at the top of the social hierarchy while relegating everyone else to the margins. But Michael wasn't going to let him get away with it. It wasn't enough to expose the restaurant's discriminatory practices. He needed to ensure that Garold faced the consequences of his actions. and the world needed to know the full extent of what Gerald had done, not just to Michael and Emma, but to countless others who had been victims of his toxic beliefs. With the help of Sarah, the investigative journalist who had been instrumental in bringing the story to light, Michael and Emma began to prepare for the next stage of their fight. They knew that the public outrage over Gerold's actions had only just begun. The evidence they had gathered was undeniable, and now it was time to expose the man behind the curtain. The more they learned about Gerold, the more determined they became to ensure that his empire would fall. It wasn't just about one restaurant or one man. It was about dismantling the systems of inequality and discrimination that allowed people like Gerold to thrive unchecked. But Michael and Emma also knew that this fight was not just about them. It was about every person who had ever been marginalized, every person who had been pushed aside because of their race or background. They had already started a movement, but now it was time to push it further. They couldn't let this injustice remain hidden any longer. They had the evidence, they had the support, and they had the drive to bring Gerold to his knees. As the investigation continued and the public's anger grew, Gerold began to realize that the walls were closing in around him. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it. The reputation he had so carefully cultivated over the years was now a distant memory, replaced by the image of a man who had built his success on a foundation of racism and exclusion. The cracks in his empire were spreading, and the pressure was mounting from all sides. The Winstons, meanwhile, were more resolute than ever. They knew that Gerold was facing the consequences of his actions, but they also knew that the battle wasn't over yet. They had started something that could not be undone. The question now was, would Gerold be able to salvage anything from the wreckage of his empire, or was this the beginning of the end for his once glorious restaurant chain? The answer that was never enough. The days following the public revelation of Gerold's racist practices at the Grand Oak were nothing short of chaotic. The backlash was swift and unforgiving. The restaurant's social media profiles were flooded with angry comments from former patrons and employees alike. The press was relentless, digging into every corner of Gerold's business, his personal life, and the web of systemic discrimination he had spent years weaving. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, Gerold's response to the crisis seemed like nothing more than a series of poorly calculated moves. In an attempt to stem the tide of outrage, Gerold appeared on live television for an exclusive interview, hoping that a public apology would be enough to quell the anger. He had hoped that his decades of success in the restaurant business would grant him some level of forgiveness, that the weight of his achievements would somehow overshadow the darker truths that had now been exposed. But it was quickly clear to the public that Gerold's apology was little more than a facade, a hollow attempt to salvage his reputation in the face of undeniable guilt. The interview, which had been carefully crafted by his PR team, began with Gerold offering a generic expression of regret. He spoke about how sorry he was for the incident with Michael and Emma Winston, emphasizing that it was a one-off situation, a mistake made by a few bad actors within his company. He was quick to deflect responsibility, suggesting that the real issue lay with a few rogue employees who had misunderstood his vision of exclusivity. However, it didn't take long for the cracks to show. The questions from the interviewer grew sharper, forcing Gerold to address the systemic issues within his company. As Gerold struggled to answer, it became painfully clear to the audience that his apology was insincere, his words rehearsed and defensive. He kept repeating that the actions of his employees were isolated incidents, that he was just a businessman who had never intended for his restaurant to embody such discrimination. But the public wasn't buying it. Every word Garold uttered only seemed to further confirm the suspicions that had been bubbling under the surface for years. His dismissal of systemic racism as an isolated incident was insulting. His attempt to placate the media with empty words only amplified the outrage. The pressure continued to mount as more and more individuals came forward with their own stories of discrimination at the Grand Oak. Former employees who had once been afraid to speak up now found the courage to share their experiences. The testimonies painted a devastating picture of Garold's business, one that had perpetuated an unspoken but pervasive culture of exclusion. The Winstons had succeeded in starting a movement, and the floodgates had opened. In the wake of Garold's failed apology, Emma and Michael found themselves at the center of an even larger battle. What had once been a personal crusade for justice had transformed into a much broader conversation about race, privilege, and corporate responsibility. They had gone from victims of a humiliating incident to the faces of a movement that demanded systemic change. But as the world watched Garold struggle, something unexpected happened. The consequences for his actions began to snowball, and it became increasingly clear that Garold's fate was sealed. The public outcry intensified as investors and high-profile patrons began to sever ties with the restaurant chain. His once loyal clientele, who had dined at the Grand Oak for years, suddenly found themselves faced with the uncomfortable truth of their complicity. Even the most ardent supporters of Garold's brand started to question their own role in enabling an institution built on exclusion. The fallout wasn't just financial, it was moral too. Garold's wealth and status had protected him for years, but now it seemed as though everything he had built was slipping through his fingers. His investors began pulling their funding. Prominent chefs and culinary figures publicly distanced themselves from him, refusing to be associated with his name. The backlash was so overwhelming that it became impossible for Garold to continue managing the empire he had once controlled with such confidence. And then came the legal challenges. As more lawsuits piled up against the Grand Oak, Garold found himself facing mounting legal bills and an ever-growing list of accusers. Michael and Emma's case had been just the beginning. Soon, other former employees, some of whom had left the company years ago, began to file lawsuits accusing the restaurant of discriminatory hiring practices, unequal pay, and harassment. The legal team Garold had once relied on now found themselves unable to defend him. But perhaps the most significant consequence of all came when federal authorities stepped in. Investigators from the Department of Justice began to examine the broader implications of the case, looking into potential violations of federal civil rights laws. Garold was no longer just facing a public relations nightmare or a financial crisis. He was now dealing with the full weight of the law. The once prominent restaurant owner, whose name had been synonymous with luxury dining, now found himself on the wrong side of history. His efforts to salvage his reputation were futile. The damage had already been done. His failure to address the systemic racism within his business was no longer something that could be swept under the rug. For Michael and Emma, the aftermath was a bittersweet victory. They had exposed the truth, but at what cost? The fallout from their fight was far-reaching. It wasn't just Gerald's career that had been destroyed. It was the entire system of exclusion that had enabled him to thrive. And yet, despite the success of their campaign, they both knew that the fight for justice didn't end with one victory. The real change would only come when businesses across the country recognized the impact of their actions and began to address the systemic inequalities in their own organizations. Michael and Emma had forced the world to confront the ugly truth about racism in the restaurant industry. But now the question was whether anyone would take meaningful action to ensure that it didn't happen again. Public outcry and protest movements. As the full extent of the discrimination at the Grand Oak became known, public outrage erupted on a scale none of them had anticipated. What had begun as a personal battle for Michael and Emma Winston had quickly turned into a nationwide conversation about race, privilege, and accountability. The story, once confined to the walls of one restaurant, now rippled across every major city, touching the lives of thousands who had experienced similar injustices. The protests started small, with a few impassioned activists and local organizations calling for a boycott of the restaurant. But as the media continued to cover the scandal, more and more people began to take to the streets. Their voices joined in a unified demand for justice. The hashtag #boycott the Grand Oak became a rallying cry for anyone who had ever been made to feel less than because of their race, their background, or their identity. Within days, the protests had spread far beyond the restaurant's physical locations. Activists organized peaceful marches holding signs with powerful messages like "Equality Now," "End Racism," and "No Room for Hate." Social media became a powerful tool for mobilizing the masses. Videos of the protests were shared by thousands, many of them capturing the powerful stories of people who had been personally impacted by Gerald's brand of discrimination. Black employees from all over the country, some of whom had worked in similar high-end restaurants, came forward to share their own stories of being mistreated and overlooked. One of the most significant turning points came when a well-known celebrity chef, once a regular guest at the Grand Oak, publicly declared his support for the protests. Chef Ramon Delaney, a prominent figure in the culinary world, had dined at Gerald's restaurant for years, proudly promoting it to his fans. But as the full scope of the scandal became clear, Chef Delaney issued a statement condemning Gerald's actions and called for a nationwide movement to address racism within the food industry. His endorsement of the protests brought even more attention to the cause, and soon other chefs, restaurateurs, and celebrities followed suit, amplifying the movement even further. The protests weren't just happening outside the walls of the Grand Oak. They were happening in every major city, in front of government buildings, at corporate offices, and in front of restaurants with similar practices. What had initially been about a single incident in a high-end restaurant had now transformed into a full-scale social justice movement. It was clear that the system had failed to address the issues of racism and inequality for far too long, and now the public was demanding change. In the midst of all this, Michael and Emma continued to advocate for real change. Their victory over Gerald was just the beginning. They had become symbols of resistance, showing the world that even ordinary people could bring about change when they stood up against injustice. They didn't want to just bring down one man. They wanted to dismantle the systems that had allowed people like Gerald to thrive for so long. Through a series of interviews, public appearances, and grassroots organizing, Michael and Emma began to speak about the broader implications of their fight. They spoke not just about what had happened to them at the Grand Oak, but about the culture of exclusion and elitism that pervaded the restaurant industry as a whole. They spoke about how businesses, especially those in the hospitality industry, needed to be held accountable for their practices, not just when it came to customer service, but also when it came to hiring, promotions, and day-to-day operations. They also began working with organizations dedicated to ending discrimination in the workplace. They joined forces with civil rights groups, advocacy organizations, and legal teams to push for legislation that would make it easier for employees to report discrimination without fear of retaliation. They wanted to ensure that no one would ever have to face what they had faced at the Grand Oak, not just in restaurants, but in every industry. As the protests grew, so did the media coverage. News outlets, both local and national, began dedicating entire segments to the issue. Television anchors spoke with experts, interviewing labor rights advocates and diversity consultants who explained how widespread racism was in the corporate world. They analyzed the role that elite spaces, restaurants, hotels, high-end retail establishments played in perpetuating a culture of exclusion. The conversation wasn't just about one restaurant anymore. It was about the larger societal structures that allowed people like Gerald to flourish without consequence. But despite the growing momentum, the Winstons knew that the real battle was still ahead. The protests were powerful, but they needed to translate that energy into lasting change. The work that Michael and Emma were doing behind the scenes was just as important as the public outcry. They continued to push for reforms at every level of government, lobbying for stronger anti-discrimination laws in the workplace. They met with lawmakers and presented their case for creating accountability measures that would hold businesses accountable for the discrimination they perpetuated, whether intentionally or not. It wasn't just about Gerald anymore. It was about shifting the entire paradigm, about creating a world where businesses couldn't get away with ignoring the voices of marginalized groups. The public support was a massive boon, but real change required legislative action. It would take time, but Michael and Emma were willing to fight for it. As the weeks passed, more and more businesses began to take notice of the protests. Some restaurants, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, began to publicly declare their commitment to diversity and inclusion. They announced new hiring practices and pledged to establish systems for reporting discrimination. But Michael and Emma weren't fooled. They knew these statements needed to be backed by real action, not just PR stunts. And they were watching closely, holding these businesses to account. The protests that had begun with a single act of racism in a restaurant had now become a movement that reached across the country. And with every protest, every rally, and every new story shared by people who had been hurt, the Winstons felt their resolve strengthening. This was not just their fight anymore. It was a collective fight, a fight that would require the work of every person willing to stand up and say, "Enough is enough." The wave of change was building, and the Winstons were at the forefront of it. But as they took each step forward, they knew that the battle wasn't over. Gerald's downfall was just the beginning. The real work would be in ensuring that the kind of discrimination they had exposed would never happen again, and they were determined to be the ones who led that charge. The impact on leadership and corporate policies. The aftermath of the scandals surrounding Garold and the Grand Oak sent shockwaves through the hospitality industry. What had been seen as a one-off incident of bad customer service and poor management quickly evolved into a corporate crisis of unprecedented proportions. It wasn't just the restaurant that was under scrutiny. It was the entire industry, a system that, for years, had allowed racism and discrimination to run rampant beneath the polished exterior of high-end dining establishments. As the dust settled and the story began to fade from the daily news cycle, Michael and Emma Winston remained at the center of it all. They had become the faces of a movement, not just fighting for justice in the restaurant they had been humiliated in, but fighting for justice in every institution that allowed inequality to persist unchecked. Their fight had turned into something far bigger than they could have imagined, and the changes they were advocating for had only just begun. With public outrage still simmering, business leaders and executives in the hospitality industry began to take stock of their own practices. For years, many had turned a blind eye to the subtle forms of racism and exclusion in their organizations, assuming that a few bad apples were to blame for any complaints that arose. But the explosive nature of the scandal at the Grand Oak forced them to confront a much larger problem, one that could no longer be ignored or swept under the rug. The first sign that things were changing came when several high-profile restaurants, under pressure from the public, began to announce new diversity initiatives. They pledged to reevaluate their hiring practices, commit to diversity training programs for all employees, and establish transparent procedures for reporting discrimination. These moves were seen as a response to the growing demand for accountability, but Michael and Emma were quick to point out that words were meaningless without real action. They weren't just asking for symbolic gestures, they were demanding systemic change. Michael had already been in talks with several industry leaders, using his own success in the business world to push for broader reforms. He had spent years building his own empire from the ground up, and he knew that real change in any business required a shift in leadership and corporate policies. No amount of diversity training would work unless leaders in the restaurant industry took full responsibility for creating a culture of inclusivity and accountability. Through his connections, Michael managed to convene a group of business leaders, human rights advocates, and diversity experts to discuss what needed to be done. The group held several meetings over the following months, hammering out a set of guidelines and policies aimed at eradicating discrimination in the hospitality industry. The goal was clear: to create a new standard that would hold restaurants and other businesses accountable for their treatment of employees and customers of color. The first step in this process was to establish a code of conduct for all restaurants, outlining the expectations for inclusivity and anti-discrimination practices. This would include clear guidelines for hiring, promotions, and employee treatment. The code also emphasized the importance of creating safe spaces for employees to report incidents of discrimination without fear of retaliation. Michael and Emma, who had been at the heart of this movement, worked tirelessly to ensure that these standards were more than just a set of rules. They were a commitment to creating real, lasting change. But even as progress was being made, challenges remained. Not everyone in the industry was willing to change. Some restaurant owners and managers who had long benefited from the exclusivity and elitism of their establishments, saw the new push for diversity and inclusion as a threat to their business model. They argued that it would dilute the quality of their clientele and water down their brand. Others felt that they were being unfairly targeted, that the scrutiny of their businesses was an overreaction to a single high-profile incident. These voices, though loud, were in the minority. The vast majority of restaurant owners, employees, and patrons were eager for change. Many of them recognized that the very future of the industry depended on its ability to adapt to the evolving demands of society. The Winstons, through their advocacy and tireless efforts, had created a paradigm shift in the way people viewed race, privilege, and inclusion in the world of fine dining. The next step in this long process was to address the leadership structures within these companies. It wasn't enough to just change hiring policies or offer diversity training. There needed to be a fundamental shift in the way companies were led. Michael was determined to ensure that these changes went to the top levels of management, where decisions were being made that could either perpetuate or challenge the status quo. The conversation around leadership began to shift, with an increasing number of restaurant owners and executives realizing that they needed to look inward. They needed to ask themselves hard questions about whether they were creating environments where all employees felt valued and respected. Were they promoting leaders who reflected the diversity of the communities they served? Were they fostering cultures that supported people of all backgrounds? Or were they inadvertently creating spaces that were hostile to those who didn't fit a particular mold? Michael was not alone in his push for these reforms. Many of the employees who had come forward during the investigation became allies in the fight for change, helping to shape the future of the restaurant industry. These individuals had seen the inner workings of the system firsthand and understood the importance of holding leaders accountable for their actions. They were the voices that had been silenced for so long, and now they were part of a movement that would ensure no one would ever have to go through what they had endured. But the change wasn't immediate. The Winstons knew that the road ahead would be long, and there would be many obstacles to overcome. There would always be resistance. There would always be those who clung to the old ways of doing business, who saw the push for equality as a threat rather than an opportunity. But Michael and Emma were undeterred. Their victory over Gerald was only the beginning. As the months passed, more and more companies began to adopt the new guidelines. Some restaurant chains, including several owned by high-profile chefs and entrepreneurs, publicly committed to the new standards. These changes were not without challenges, but they were a clear sign that the industry was evolving. For Michael and Emma, this was just the start of a much larger fight. Their personal battle had turned into a full-scale movement, one that would forever change the way the restaurant industry operated and the way people thought about race, privilege, and power. The shift in leadership and corporate policies was only the first step. The real work, they knew, would come in making sure these changes took root, ensuring that the lessons learned from Gerold's fall were not forgotten. The fight for equality was never going to be easy, but it was a fight they were determined to win. The collapse of an empire. The slow and methodical collapse of Gerold's empire was a sight to behold. Once an influential and wealthy figure in the city's restaurant industry, Gerold now found himself staring at the consequences of his own arrogance and bigotry. The backlash from the public, fueled by the scandal surrounding the Grand Oak, continued to spread like wildfire, irreparably damaging his reputation. What began as an isolated incident had now snowballed into an industry-wide crisis that no one, not even Gerold, could have anticipated. Michael and Emma Winston had done what they set out to do. They had exposed the ugly truth that Gerold had worked so hard to hide, and in doing so, they had unwittingly launched a nationwide movement. But as the investigation continued and the media's coverage of the scandal intensified, Gerold's world began to unravel at an alarming rate. The shockwaves from the revelation of his racist practices reverberated throughout the city, leaving no corner of his business untouched. At first, Gerold tried to salvage his restaurant chain by implementing superficial changes, diversity training programs, public apologies, and pledges to improve his business practices. But these gestures were too little, too late. His attempts to win back public favor were seen as transparent and insincere. The damage had already been done, and no amount of PR spin could undo the harm his actions had caused. The financial ramifications were swift and unforgiving. Longtime patrons, many of whom had once considered themselves loyal to Gerold's brand of exclusivity, began to abandon the Grand Oak in droves. They could no longer stomach supporting a restaurant that had become synonymous with discrimination. As the number of reservations dwindled, the revenue stream that had once been so steady began to dry up. The backlash from the public was so intense that even those who had previously enjoyed the restaurant's luxurious offerings began to reconsider their loyalty. It was clear now that supporting the Grand Oak wasn't just a matter of bad optics. It was about supporting a business that had actively perpetuated harmful, exclusionary practices. But it wasn't just the customers who turned their backs on Gerold. Investors who had once lined up to pour money into his restaurant chain now withdrew their support. Gerold's wealth, built on years of success and a reputation for luxury, had given him a false sense of security. He had always assumed that his status in the culinary world would protect him from the consequences of his actions. But now investors and business partners saw the writing on the wall. The risk of being associated with a man accused of systemic racism was too great. One by one, his investors began to sever ties with him, leaving Gerold with little financial backing to sustain his operations. The final blow came when a prominent restaurant critic, who had once been a supporter of the Grand Oak, wrote a scathing expose detailing Gerold's history of discriminatory practices. The critic's piece, which was published in a major national newspaper, highlighted not just the scandals surrounding Michael and Emma's experience, but also the broader, long-standing issue of race and exclusion within the restaurant industry. The article painted Gerold as a man who had used his power and privilege to perpetuate inequality, and it further solidified the public's opinion of him as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the industry. Gerold, already reeling from the financial and reputational damage, was now forced to face the legal consequences of his actions. Lawsuits from former employees, many of whom had suffered under the toxic culture he had created, flooded in. The legal team that Gerold had once relied on, those who had helped him manage his business affairs for years, now found themselves overwhelmed with the volume of lawsuits. The once untouchable businessman was now facing a battle on all fronts, in the courts, in the media, and in the public eye. The most damning lawsuit came from a group of former employees who had been subjected to racist treatment during their time at the Grand Oak. The employees, many of whom had worked there for years, filed a class action lawsuit against Gerald and his company, seeking compensation for the emotional distress and financial losses they had endured. This legal action was the tipping point. The public outcry grew louder, and the calls for Gerold's accountability became impossible to ignore. As the lawsuits piled up, the restaurant chain that Gerold had spent years building began to crumble. The media coverage grew increasingly hostile, with every new story further tarnishing Gerold's reputation. The final blow came when Gerold was forced to make a public statement acknowledging the breadth of the discrimination that had taken place under his watch. He issued a half-hearted apology, but by this point, it was too little, too late. The public had already made its judgment. Gerold was no longer a figure of admiration and respect in the culinary world. He was a cautionary tale of unchecked power and privilege. In the end, Gerold's empire fell apart. The once thriving restaurant chain, with locations across the city and even some in other states, was forced to close its doors for good. The Grand Oak became a symbol of everything that was wrong with an industry that had long ignored the voices of marginalized communities. And as Gerold's business crumbled, so did his social standing. His once pristine reputation, built on exclusivity and luxury, was shattered beyond repair. For Michael and Emma, Gerold's fall was bittersweet. They had won the battle they had set out to fight, but the victory came at a great cost. The process had been grueling, emotionally taxing, and fraught with challenges, yet, as they watched the restaurant's doors close for the last time, they knew that their fight had made a difference. It wasn't just about bringing down one man. It was about showing the world that injustice could not go unchecked, and that those who perpetuated systems of inequality would eventually face the consequences of their actions. As Gerold's empire lay in ruins, Michael and Emma knew that the road ahead would be long. The work wasn't over yet, but they had taken the first step, and that was something to be proud of. They had exposed the ugly truth, and in doing so, they had sparked a movement for change, a movement that would ripple across industries and continue to demand justice for all. The lessons learned and the future of change. As the dust settled and the final remnants of Gerold's empire were swept away, Michael and Emma Winston found themselves standing at the forefront of something much larger than they could have imagined. Their personal journey, from the humiliation of a racist encounter at a fine dining restaurant, to the downfall of one of the most powerful men in the city's hospitality industry, had ignited a movement that would ripple far beyond their own experience. What began as a fight for justice in their own lives had now become a catalyst for systemic change across industries. In the weeks that followed the closure of the Grand Oak, the Winstons were approached by countless individuals, employees, activists, business leaders, and legal experts, who thanked them for their courage and for bringing attention to the pervasive problem of racism in the restaurant industry. It wasn't just about the downfall of one man. It was about the fight for equality and justice in every industry, in every sector, and in every community where racism had gone unchecked for too long. The changes they fought for, however, were far from simple. As they began to reflect on the long and difficult path they had taken, they realized that the true work was not just about exposing Gerold or forcing him to face the consequences of his actions. The real victory, Michael and Emma understood, was in the lessons they had learned along the way. The lessons about systemic racism, privilege, and the power of solidarity in the face of injustice. First and foremost, the Winstons knew that racism, in its many forms, was deeply entrenched in the systems of power that governed not just the restaurant industry, but many industries across the country. They had seen firsthand how wealth, status, and influence were used to perpetuate inequality. They had seen how Gerald's empire, built on a foundation of exclusion and elitism, had managed to survive for so long precisely because of the privilege that allowed those in power to operate without accountability. But they also learned that change was possible, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Their fight had shown them that even the most powerful institutions could be brought down by the sheer force of truth and the collective will of those who refused to remain silent. They had taken on a giant, and they had won. The victory, however, was not just theirs. It was a victory for everyone who had been marginalized, silenced, and excluded for far too long. One of the most important lessons that Michael and Emma learned was the importance of creating systemic change. It wasn't enough to simply tear down the walls of a single business. The fight for justice required them to push for long-term reforms, for new laws, for better protections for employees, and for the creation of a culture that valued inclusion, respect, and equality at every level. The Winstons began to work with lawmakers, legal experts, and business leaders to create and implement new policies that would ensure that no one would ever again have to face the kind of humiliation they had experienced at the Grand Oak. The changes began to take root. Several other restaurants and businesses, watching the fallout from Gerald's collapse, began to implement their own diversity and inclusion programs. Many of the largest corporate chains in the hospitality industry now faced pressure to publicly commit to anti-discrimination policies and to be held accountable for the treatment of their employees. They knew that ignoring the lessons of the Winstons' case would be disastrous for their bottom lines and for their public image. But for Michael and Emma, the real victory lay in the countless stories that began to emerge in the wake of their efforts. Employees who had once been too afraid to speak out came forward with their own experiences of discrimination. These were stories that had long been ignored, swept under the rug by powerful employers who believed they were untouchable. But now, with the spotlight shining on the issue, the victims of racism in the workplace were no longer silent. Michael and Emma knew that the work wasn't over. It would take years of sustained effort to root out the systemic biases that had become so ingrained in the culture of many industries. But they also knew that they had sparked something that could not be undone. The conversation about race and privilege in the workplace had changed forever. As they watched the gradual but significant changes unfold, Michael and Emma began to think about their next steps. They had already started their own foundation, dedicated to fighting discrimination and promoting diversity and inclusion in the workplace. They traveled the country, speaking at conferences, meeting with business leaders, and continuing to spread the message of equality and justice that had driven their journey. They knew that they had a responsibility to keep pushing, to keep fighting for the voices that had been ignored for so long. The future, however, was full of promise. The road to equality was long and difficult, but Michael and Emma now understood that they were part of something larger than themselves. Their actions had proven that even one voice, one couple, could change the course of history. And while the battle against discrimination was far from over, Michael and Emma Winston knew that they had started a movement that would continue to grow, a movement that would continue to fight for the rights of those who had been denied them for far too long. The story of Geralt's empire, once a shining example of elitism and exclusivity, would now be remembered as a cautionary tale of how the abuse of power could lead to its own downfall. And for Michael and Emma, their legacy would be one of hope, courage, and a reminder that the fight for justice was worth every sacrifice. Their journey had been long and at times painful, but in the end, they had proven that change was possible, and that together people could stand up and make their voices heard. The Winstons had not only taken down a powerful man, they had given rise to a movement that would inspire generations to come, and that, in the end, was their greatest victory.